it was one of those teachers, and she actually didn't believe me and wanted a letter from my mother telling her that I was actually losing my vision because she just thought I was trying to get out of doing work. And so she actually made me use a sewing machine even though I couldn't see the needle. Hello and welcome to the Blindseyepodcast, the podcast discussing everything you did and didn't want to know about being blind. My name is Connor, and this week I thought I would talk about school and the logistics of learning and my experience with all of that in high school. I was just going to make this one big school episode, but I'm going to break it up into two parts. So this week we're just going to do the logistics of learning, studying, getting materials, doing my exams, how that all worked. And then next week, I'm going to be talking about my school life and how that all kind of worked, interacting, socializing, all that kind of jazz. As always, if you like what I do, please consider subscribing on whatever it is you have and whatever it is you listen to, or like and share the Facebook pages or Instagram or Twitter, whatever it might be. All that is at the end of the show if you're looking for specific pages. And let's get cracking. Okay, so when it comes to high school, I was in year 7, which is the first year of high school in Australia. I was 12, so I was 6 months into high school. My vision was completely fine. And then in the July of that first year of high school was when my vision started to go. So initially, obviously my vision went slowly, I guess, even though it was medically quickly, but it went over about 6 months. So I was still able to do some things, but the initial reaction from a lot of the teachers, some of the teachers actually didn't believe me. They just thought I was lying. So I remember this particular teacher, we had to do sewing, I think it was. It was one of those deals in the early years of high school where, you know, the girls have to do stuff that's typically considered boy stuff, like woodwork and metalwork, and the guys also get introduced to the sewing and the cooking and all that kind of stuff. So it was one of those teachers, and she actually didn't believe me and wanted a letter from my mother telling her that I was actually losing my vision because she just thought I was trying to get out of doing work. And so she actually made me use a sewing machine even though I couldn't see the needle. So I'd have to feed this thing into the sewing machine and I couldn't see the needle. So I was quite lucky that nothing worse happened, but she was just a bitch. So, but yeah, so that was kind of one of my first experiences when it started happening. Just a bit of disbelief of teachers and a few of friends. The other thing was that my school had never had a blind student before, or a student with severe visual loss like I did. So the school was completely unequipped, and they tried to convince me in the early days to go to another school or a quote unquote special school, but my mum and I refused that because there's pros and cons, because I would have lost out on the social aspect if I went to one of those schools, because I might be surrounded by people I couldn't really communicate with because they had other difficulties or disabilities. And our mentality was, well, the school needs to get with the program. I'm not going to be the last blind kid who ever comes here, so get with the 21st century, basically. So with all of that happening, the special education teacher within the school actually didn't even know that I existed until 6 months after my vision was starting to go. So I was already having difficulty in class for about 6 months before the actual specified teacher within the school was even made aware of who I was. And I found that out in later years, that she was never even made aware of me. So that will kind of give you a bit of an insight as to what was going on. So in terms of the logistics of learning, the first few weeks or the first few months kind of revolved around larger pieces of paper. So because I couldn't see what was actually happening on the blackboard or on normal sized pieces of paper, they started to blow up larger and larger pieces of paper for me so I could read. And that worked to a point for a certain amount of time, but it was also really, really embarrassing because at one point, these pieces of paper were like the size of posters. So you can imagine as a 12-year-old, somebody comes into the class with this massive poster-sized piece of paper to put on your desk, and you just feel like such a little outcast who is the odd one out. And nobody wants to be the odd one out in high school because that's just suicide, basically, at high school. So that was my first couple of months experience of when it really first started. Because my vision diminished so rapidly, the large pieces of paper didn't really last too long, thankfully, in some ways. So I was then made to learn how to touch type. Now, touch typing, for anybody who doesn't know, is just being able to type on a keyboard without having to look where the keys are or use one finger at a time or two fingers like some people might do. So it's knowing where all the keys are and being able to use all 10 digits to be able to type quickly and consistently. Now, the way they train you to do this is basically they put a laptop in front of me. They loaded this program onto it, which spoke out loud what letters I was pressing. And then the program runs through and says out loud what letters it wants me to press. So it might say A, and then I'd have to press A. And then it would say S, and I'd have to press S, and so on and so on. But it would speed up so that you would have to try and do it quicker and quicker and quicker. Or it might want you to press M, which is on the bottom line of the keyboard, and then it would want you to press Q, which is on the top line of the keyboard. So it was to get you familiar with where all the different letters were to be able to respond quickly and be able to do it at a certain speed. Now, in hindsight, I'm really glad that I was forced to learn this, but at the time, I absolutely hated it because, one, it was so different than anything that I'd done before. I was reading and writing normally. I was using pens and pencils. So I didn't like that thing that I was doing something different from everybody else because, again, you don't want to be that kid in high school. But the other part of it was somebody in their wisdom decided that they would do these lessons with me and pull me out of my normal classes to do them, but they would be the classes that I could still kind of do without much modification. So it always seemed to happen that I was pulled out to do touch typing lessons when I was in art class. And when I was in art class, I might not be able to paint, but I used to use clay because obviously that's all touch. And everybody else in the class never got to use clay. So for once, I was the odd one out, but I was the odd one out and everybody was envious of the fact that I was using clay. So it was something I could do normally, something everybody else wanted to be able to do that I was doing, not them. So I kind of felt good about myself, but they would pull me out of that class to do the touch typing when it was one of the only classes I could do without really feeling like a weirdo and feeling like I wasn't fitting in. So that made it extra hard. Also, some of the big classes that I had problems with or that I excelled in were maths on one extreme. So with maths, everybody knows when you get taught when you're young, you learn it in its grids. So you have the tens, hundredths, and the units. And you learn, 4/8, carry the 1, and you do it all visually, and it's all laid out in a grid, and that's how you work it out. But because I couldn't do that anymore, I couldn't do that in my head. I couldn't visualize being able to put some of the digits to the side, remember the working out, and getting it to function visually in my own head without actually being able to see it. So my math skills really diminished and the classes just became really difficult. I'm sure there is a way of doing it, but it was never really expressed to me how I could do it in a better way than we were trying. And because it just became so exhausting and troublesome that once I got to year 9 and we were able to drop classes, I unfortunately dropped math because it was just such a headache and I just couldn't really do it. And it was really starting to get into algebra and all these kinds of stuff that's much higher level. And unfortunately, because of that, now my math skills as a 31-year-old are atrocious. So it's a shame that that's what happened, but at the time you're just trying to survive, and it was just more trouble than it was worth, unfortunately. One of the classes I really loved was music because I could just play. But then obviously I have that upside that once I'm behind a drum kit or on a guitar, I'm just like everybody else. But you have the downside of I didn't know how to learn musical theory in a way that somebody who was blind would be able to do it. And none of the people around me or none of the teachers around me were aware that it could be done either. So it wasn't until I got to later in life that I actually realized there is a way of doing it, but I wasn't surrounded by people who knew that that was a possibility. So it was just thrown off to the side, and the only expectation for me was that I could just play and try and pick up as much as I could by listening. And I will come back to that expectations thing later on because it is a big part of this. So it might be this episode or it might be an episode of its own, but it is a big part of when you have a disability, the whole expectations and goal setting stuff. So with all of this, when it happened, I got assigned an itinerant teacher and a teacher's aide. Now, an itinerant teacher is basically a specialized teacher, in my case for vision or blindness, that would go from school to school and visit the students that might be blind or have visual issues at those schools and see how they're doing, organize whatever needs to be organized, if they need certain resources, if they need certain kinds of technology, and somebody who was a bit more involved in that kind of disability and the teaching side of that disability to help the schools out. So I had one person helping me with that, and then I also had another gentleman who would actually help me in class. And when I say help me in class, I mean somebody who would actually read to me whatever it was that we were reading in class. So as good as it was at the time, again, when you're a teenager, it's very hard because I had this middle-aged plus man sitting next to me in class the entire time, reading things to me out loud so I could try and take them in and learn. And then I would talk back to him what my answers are. But there's that natural part of class where there's a bit of banter going on. People are sniggering. People are seeing what they can get away with. And all of that is just a normal part of high school, whether people like it or not. But not only did I have a teacher in the classroom, I also then had my own personal teacher who was beside me. So it also meant that I couldn't really involve myself in what everybody else was getting up to in the class. And even though, again, it's not supposed to be the stuff that we're supposed to be doing because we're just acting like idiots, but it is a normal part of being in school. And because I always had somebody next to me going, come on, you shouldn't be doing that, then everybody else kind of got a different experience than I did. So in one way, yes, I had somebody educationally with me all the time, but it just added to that isolation of I'm not like everybody else and everybody else is getting away with things that I can't get away with, and I can't just be a normal, annoying teenager who's not listening. So some people say that's a good thing, but as far as I was concerned at the time, that just made me feel worse about the situation I was in. It was basically just the wrong age and the wrong time because it just didn't work. As well-intentioned as it was, and as much as it helped me out learning-wise, it just clashed with everything else. So that eventually got relaxed a little bit, even though I had these people the entire way through high school, but I got relaxed a little bit when my touch typing skills got good enough because I was then given a machine called a note taker. Now, a note taker is basically just a laptop without a screen. So it's just a keyboard and a speaker. And I would plug my headphones into it and it would speak to me, and it would have filing systems in there and documents that I could write on and all that kind of stuff. So it was basically just a computer without a screen that I would bring to and from lessons. And what would happen is the itinerant teacher or the teacher's aide, they would put materials on little cartridges for me. And then I would put that cartridge into the computer and that would read out loud to me whatever the book was that I was having to read or whatever the material was. So for those teachers, they would have to speak to the teacher and say, what are we going to be learning in the next couple of weeks? They would put that into some kind of format that I could get my hands on. Then they would give that to me, and then I would try and do my work either on that or just read it. And then sometimes if I was doing my work on that, I'd save it onto the cartridge, give it to them, and then they would print it out and give it to the teachers. That's basically how that worked. And again, it was a bit of a catch-22 because it meant I had a little bit less one-on-one time with these teachers' assistants, but I was also the guy using this weird thing that doesn't even really look like a laptop in class. So it was a trade-off. Eventually, after that, for a couple of years, I was given a laptop to use. So just a normal laptop with a screen reader on it, which was JAWS, which I've talked about in other episodes before. And basically, yeah, it was just a normal laptop, and then I could just use Word documents, and then those same teachers would give things to me on a USB or a CD or whatever it might be, and then I could do my work like that. But again, all of that relied on the teachers knowing what they were doing far enough ahead of time to be able to let me and those teachers know what we needed to copy, so then that could be copied and formatted in enough time to give to me that then I could do it alongside everybody else in the class. So there's a lot of scheduling going on and trying to work out where we're going to be in a couple of weeks so that I wasn't getting left behind. So in terms of doing tests and exams, things were kind of similar but a little bit different again. So for the most part, I had a system in place called a reader-writer. So basically, I would go into a room, there would be another student there or a person brought in from outside of the school, and they would read each question to me out loud, and then I would say to them what I wanted the answer to be and to write that back in. Now, it probably doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was quite exhausting because you're having to spend hours upon hours with somebody really listening to what they were saying, and then I'm having to very specifically tell them what to write, where to put in a comma, where to put in a full stop, because obviously I'm being judged on my grammar as well as the content. So I'm trying to do something that I had learned visually for 12 years, what the right and wrong things were to do and where commas should and shouldn't be and full stops. And a lot of that by the time you're 12 just becomes visual. You know, you look at a word and you go, that word doesn't look right. And you might not know what's wrong yet, but you learn what things look like, or you learn what a sentence looks like if it's too long. And you can kind of spot that visually. But when you're just talking, that kind of stuff goes out the window. So it becomes a very tedious, drawn out experience. And unfortunately, and I kind of think a bit unfairly, a lot of teachers used to grade me down and say, Connor writes like he's talking. But a lot of my experience of learning was done via talking because I wasn't seeing documents laid out in a clipped, formatted, professional kind of way. A lot of it was talking, or it was the computer talking to me, or it was somebody else talking to me. So I learned how to get an education audibly and using my words. But then unfortunately I would get marked down saying that I write like I speak, which was in my mind kind of inevitable because of the way I had to go about it. Thankfully, that reader-writer situation came good when I was in my final year and doing my final leaving exams, because I can't quite remember whether I asked for it, but I think I may have said, look, these are the biggest exams I'm ever going to do while I'm at school. They're the longest ones, so I wanted to know if I could do them on a laptop, and that's eventually what happened. So somebody would give me a USB with the blank exam papers on it, and then I would sit in a room being supervised while I read the questions, typed in my answers, and then put it back on the USB for whoever to go and mark it and give me my results. So that worked out a lot better because it meant I had a lot more control over what I was writing. I didn't have to be next to somebody and be nice to somebody for 3 hours while doing something really, really tedious. And exams are always tedious anyway, but I didn't have that added stuff involved in that. And it also meant that when I was typing, I could type in a way that the markers were expecting rather than getting tarred with that he writes like he speaks brush. So thankfully that worked quite well, because I don't know if I would have been able to manage it if I did it the other way. And just the last two things on this. So while I may have had some bad teachers, is probably too harsh of a word, but not so many great teachers, I also did come across quite a few who were quite good, quite reasonable, and tried to adapt things. So everybody is aware of, you're at school and the teachers, understandably think, well, I have 30 students, I can't really appeal to all of them individually, which is fair enough. But in my case, that sometimes just really didn't work, and then I literally wasn't able to do what I was supposed to be doing. So the best example of this is when I was in my final 2 years, I decided to do design and technology as part of my final exams. And I was mostly doing woodwork. And at the time, people probably thought, why the hell is he doing woodwork? He's blind. But I wanted to do it, and I wanted to see if it was possible. And thankfully, I just happened to have a teacher who, before I even set foot in the workshop, he actually blindfolded himself and went around the school workshop and thought to himself, how would I design this place? Or what can I do to make this a bit more safe or user-friendly for somebody who can't see? So he put himself in my position and then came up with some really good ideas. So, for example, if I was having to use a sander, like a revolving sander, it's going at, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of revolutions a minute. If your fingertips get fed into it, your fingertips are coming off. That's basically how it works. So if I had a piece of wood that I was needing to sand down with this thing spinning at the end, he just said, look, if I give you another piece of wood alongside it, then you'll know when the piece of wood you're sanding has gotten to the right length, because the other piece of wood will touch the sander. So even just a little thing like that worked really well. Or he got me a saw that was locked in place and in this kind of harness and buckled thing. So the saw, all I had to do was move the saw back and forth. I didn't have to hold the saw up, and I could lock a piece of wood underneath it and clamp it down. So all I needed to do was find my measurements, do my measurements, and then move the saw back and forth, but it couldn't actually move from that specific area. So all these kinds of things really helped. Or one final example was, instead of using pencil to mark the wood, obviously I had an issue with that. The school got me tactile measuring tape. So every 5 or 10 centimeters or every 1 centimeter, there's a little tiny hole in the tape, and that would let me be able to count to the centimeter what I was after. And then instead of marking the wood with pencil, they gave me basically a sharp knife, so I could carve alongside the measuring tape. Instead of using a pencil line, I would just carve a line into it. So then when I came along with the saw, I could just put the saw in that line that I'd made in there when I'd engraved it. And then as long as the saw was sitting inside that little line, I could always feel whether I was on the right track or not. So this teacher just went out of his way to do that and made what everybody thought was an impossible thing possible. And I eventually finished that class, and I think I was the only person who was blind in the state at the time that year to do it. So that was a really good experience. And it was also the first major time in my life where I kind of realized that most things can be done if you just get a little bit creative about it. But if you don't get creative, or you don't come across the right people who are able to think like that or have the right information, you can very easily think that it just can't be done, and then you don't try, when it's just that you haven't come across the right information. And I know that's easier said than done, but that was my first big experience when I was 16 or 17, realizing, well, there's another way around this. The final thing I will say is that, for me anyway, because of the way things were set up and the way things were done, I found that I spent a lot of my time when I was studying in high school and in university and TAFE afterwards, which is I'll come to in other episodes. I spent a lot of my time trying to work out how I would do my homework and my classwork, and not a lot of time actually doing my homework and my classwork, because it was such an effort just to get on a even playing field with all the other students that by the time it came around to that, I was either embarrassed or exhausted or a number of things, whatever it might be, that unfortunately I kind of just went, screw it, that'll do as long as I pass. If I get 51, then I've survived, because I just need this to be over, because it was either embarrassing or it was just so exhausting having to try so hard just to be able to get to the starting position, let alone trying to excel at it, which is a shame. But at the time, when you don't know any better and you're a teenager, and at the time school seems like a stupid thing that you're forced to do anyway, it's one of those things where you're just trying to keep your head down and get out of there at 3 o'clock every day without anything too badly going wrong. And unfortunately, that was basically my experience for 6 years. Was I just wanted to get in there, do what I had to do to get everybody off my back, and get out. So it's come back to bite me a bit in later years, but at the time, I think if I was in the same situation again, the same thing would have happened. So it's a shame, but that's the nature of how it can turn out, really, if a lot of resources and stuff aren't really in place. And yeah, that's basically the logistics of how high school worked for me from a learning side. So as I said, next week in part 2, I'm going to talk about the social aspects of high school. I've touched on some of them now, but I'm going to go a bit more into that. So I hope this week's was interesting. Stay tuned for next week's. Thank you for listening. I really, really appreciate it. Again, consider subscribing or liking or sharing. And if you want to get in touch with the show, you can email blindseyepodcast@gmail.com. That's BLINDSEYE podcast@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram if you search for Blindseye Podcast. I'm on Twitter @BlindseyePod. And if you go to www.blindseyepodcast.com, it's basically the one-stop shop where all that stuff is there, all the previous episodes, some blog posts, and everything else to get in touch. So thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you next week. Cheers.